Hello, my students. In this part 3 of experimental research methods, we are going to complete this session or this presentation about experimental research design. Today, we are going to look at the internal validity and external validity of experiment. And when can we say that an experiment is valid? If it can answer the question of whether the experimental treatment was the sole or the only cause of change in the dependent variable. As you know before, that the experiment is really meant to see the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. That's the only purpose for an experiment. So can this experiment assure me that the changes in the dependent variable is only caused by the independent variable and nothing else? If it can tell me that, that means the experiment is valid. So in this case, we eliminate all other alternatives and explanations. We would be able to say that only this independent variable which made the changes, no other alternatives. So the researcher will be able to say that the treatment or the independent variable is the true causal factor producing change in the dependent variable. That means no interference was there from extraneous variables. All the variables that the researcher doesn't need in his experiment have been controlled in order to eliminate their effect on the dependent variable. I hope this is clear. But what about external? This is the internal validity. External validity, on the other hand, refers to the ability of the researcher to generalize his findings of the experiments to events outside the experiment setting. So if you have an experiment with your students, if you are a teacher and you have experiments with your students to measure the effect of extra reading in the improvement or in the development of reading skills, and you found in your experiment that giving students extra reading at home, for example, improves their reading skills. If this is your findings, now, can you say that these findings also applicable to other students or in other colleges, in other places, or only this results confined or only applicable to this particular group of students? If we can say that it is applicable for other students outside the experiment setting, that means the experiment is externally valid. Okay, so this is internal and external validity. And of course, these validity or these types of validities are affected by some factors which affect the validity. In other words, the experiment sometimes might not be valid externally or internally valid because there are certain things happen during or after or before the experiment. Here are some factors that influence the internal validity of an experiment. One of these is history. You know that experiments is not done sometimes. Some of experiments may last for 6 months or a year. And during the period, the course of this experiment, things might happen, events might happen, which may interfere or affect the experiment. And if we can think back to the example we gave in the first part about the use of fertilizers to for the growth of the plants, maybe after 1 month of the experiment, there is, for example, a lot of storms or a lot of rain or wind, dry weather, okay? So all these are beyond the control of the experimenter, but still they interfere. Maybe the results will not be as expected by the researcher. Another thing is maturation, okay, the growth. This refers to the biological and psychological or social processes that produce changes in the individuals or units of the experiment, okay, under investigation during the period of time. Imagine that, for example, you are doing an experiment measuring the effects of, again, reading comprehension on students, and you gave this experiment a period of 1 year. So you start it in the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, you want to measure the effects of extra reading on reading skills of your students. So during this period, some biological development within the students themselves, or there are some psychological development. Maybe students, some of your students might lose interest in extra reading, okay? Or there are some social processes. For example, students might lose some of their parents, or they lose some of their friends during this period, and this affects their concentration on extra reading. So all these things might also affect, and of course these are, the researcher has to be very vigilant and aware of these circumstances and changes. Another factor is the testing. Okay, I think we mentioned this in some part of this session, in maybe part 1 or part 2. We say that the pre-tests sometimes affect or change the thinking of the subjects, of the participant, about the experiment, and affect also the second or the post test. So when you give a students or participants a pre-test, okay, they might keep this test in their mind while they are doing the experiment. And because they know that later on, after the experiment, they are going to be post-tested. So in this case, this thinking ahead of what is going to happen in the experiment and what is going to happen in the post-test might alter some of the results of the experiment. The tests themselves, or the instruments used to collect data in the beginning, for example, and after the experiment. So if there is change in the type of pre-test and post-test, this might also affect the results. So in this case, the researcher needs to be very careful that the tests he uses or she uses in the beginning and after the experiment should be almost the same. And the last one is mortality. And mortality means here the death, for example, the dropout. Okay, it could be caused by death or by any means that some people or subjects of your experiments might drop out from the experiments, and this of course will not be able for them to complete the experiments, and this maybe either you continue with less number of people in your experiment, or you cancel the experiment altogether. So these are the factors that influence internal validity of the experiment. As regards the factors influencing external validity, you remember now that external validity means our ability, or the researcher's ability, to say what he found or she found in this experiment is also applicable to outside world, okay, to world outside the setting of the experiment. But there are certain factors which doesn't allow us or allow researchers to do this, to generalize their results. One of them is the reactive effect of the pre-testing. When we pre-test people before the experiments, okay, this process changes the behavior or attitudes of these people. So they become exposed to the effect of the intervention, to the independent variable. So they don't act in a natural way, these people, because they know already that they are going to be experimented, they are going to be under a study, and what they do or act or behave might not be as natural as they are in a real world. So this really, if they behave artificially in an experiment, the results that we get in the experiments might not be applicable to people outside the experiment. So we cannot generalize. And if we cannot generalize, that means the experiment lacks its external validity. Another item or another factor is the representativeness of the sample. If the sample is not representing the whole population, we always, and we studied this in the unit about sampling and sampling procedures, one of the quality of a sample is that it represents the whole population. And when we say it represents the whole population, means that the features and the characteristics available in the sample represents all the characteristics and features of the whole population. All right. So it's very important to have a random representation of the sample. And we said before, in the true experiment, randomization is one of the best features or the most important features which make the experiments a true experiment. Random sampling and random distribution of people into control and experimental groups. So in this case, if the sample is unrepresentative, this means the results that we get in this experiment, we cannot generalize it to to situations outside the experimental setting. Well, this is the end of experimental design. I hope you have understood it. It consisted of 3 parts, of course, part 1, part 2, and part 3. You can go and we visit these parts several times so that you can understand and understand all the aspects covered in these presentations. Well, wish you all the best. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.